Good morning, everyone. My name's Hamish Thorburn. I'm the chair for this session. So we have 4 speakers coming up. There'll be 25 minutes to speak and 5 minutes for questions. Just a note on the questions, we are recording this to put up the feed at a later date. So if you do have a question, if you could just wait until one of the microphones comes to you. That way, when you're talking to the microphone, it'll be recorded and we'll get the question for that. All right, to start with, from the Griffith School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, we have Troy Allard and Molly McCarthy. They're going to be talking about costing Indigenous and non-Indigenous offending trajectories. So thank you, Troy and Molly.
Okay, good morning everybody. So today we're presenting from a project that was funded by the Criminology Research Council focused on costing Indigenous and non-Indigenous offending trajectories. In terms of what we're going, at the outset I'd like to thank all the representatives from Queensland Government departments that supported this project. So obviously without their support a project such as this could not have been undertaken. In terms of what we're going to be presenting today, so I'll start off with an overview of the importance of understanding the costs of offending trajectories and some prior findings. I'll then outline the Queensland birth cohort, which is a population-based cohort of everybody who was born in 1983 and 1984 in Queensland. I'll then hand over to Molly, who will outline the trajectory modelling that was undertaken and the results of that. And then I'll outline the broad costing approach that we used in this project before handing it over to Molly, who will get into the details of how it was done within each agency and the findings. And we'll finish up with next steps and conclusions. Okay, so why on earth would anybody be interested in costing offending trajectories? So the findings from this project provide evidence to promote good decision making. So it promotes long-term thinking about crime and appropriate responses to crime. So we're all aware of the short-term political cycle, 3-4 years. So a project such as this kind of puts costs and offending over the life course so that decision makers can use that to argue for change. It leads to economically efficient decisions and can be used by those who want to advocate for change, such as increased rehabilitation programs or strategies such as justice reinvestment. There's a lack of Australian research in a few areas. So there's a lack of detailed criminal justice system costs. Most of the costs that are available are very high level, such as from ROGs or from government reports. Few have assessed costs based on key cost drivers, so we know that costs differ based on how people are processed through the system. So some key cost drivers might be diversion, offence type, whether somebody goes through a trial, and location. And few have assessed the longitudinal cost of offenders to the criminal justice system, and none have done so based on Indigenous status. In terms of prior research that has been done in this space, so differences between studies tend to impact on findings. So different studies include and assess costs in different ways. So some include only direct criminal justice system costs, others include victim costs, costs of fear, and costs associated with the lost productivity of offenders. Most include tangible costs, some include intangible costs, so there's no agreed bounds or scope in terms of what's in and what's out. This has resulted in wide-ranging cost estimates. So for example, the cost of assault has been estimated to vary between $16,000 in some studies and $85,000 in other studies. And costs also differ depending on the sample that's included. So earlier research in this space selected or created categories of offenders who had specific features, so such as a life of crime, prisoners with 30 or more convictions, or the top 10% of individuals with offences. More recent research has used trajectory modelling, which looks at offending rates over time and then groups them based on the patterns in the data. So these studies typically find about a quarter of individuals offend. Most have 1 or 2 offences, and there's a small group of chronic offenders who account for a large amount or proportion of the costs. So the key 2 research questions that we're going to be focusing on today are: how do offending trajectories for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people differ? And can we develop better estimates about the direct criminal justice system costs of offending? So the data for this project is actually based on data that was linked for another project by the Queensland Government Statisticians Office, and where we've included we're using a subset of that data. So the original data set included over 260,000 individuals and 2.1 million contacts, and those data were linked using by the GovStats using probabilistic data linkage methods. So the key data sets in our study are from the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages, so we're using births, Queensland Police Service, so cautioning and referrals to youth justice conferencing, youth justice, community-based orders and detention, Justice and Attorney General, court finalisations, and Queensland Corrective Services, community-based orders, remand and imprisonment. In terms of once all the data's been linked, we had 83,371 individuals who were born in Queensland, and of them, 27.1% offended. So we used a multi-stage medium algorithm to assign Indigenous status. So obviously when you're linking across and between so many data sets, you're going to have inconsistent and missing information. So essentially that's a more conservative way of assigning Indigenous status than other methods such as the Ever identifier. Based on that, our sample included 2,295 Indigenous people and over 81,000 non-Indigenous. So you can see there the proportions that offend. So 80% of Indigenous people in Queensland offended, had at least one contact with those systems, compared to 25.7% of non-Indigenous. So when you look at the gender breakdown for Indigenous and non-Indigenous, you'll see that non-Indigenous females offend have a similar proportion offend as Indigenous males, and for non-Indigenous female, a smaller proportion of females offend than for males. So moving on to our first research question, how do offending trajectories differ for Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians? I'll just hand over to Molly now, who will describe the trajectory modelling.
Thanks, Troy. So as Troy mentioned, this trajectory modelling is based on this birth cohort that was born in Queensland in 1983 and 1984. It's a complete birth cohort consisting of 83,371 individuals, which means that it also includes non-offenders, so it's not offenders only. We've used latent class growth modelling to estimate the trajectories using M+. And we've modelled the biennial offence frequency from age 10 to 31 years of age, capping offences at 50 for every 2-year period. And the reason for that is really just to enable the model to converge more easily. We've run separate models for Indigenous, the non-Indigenous and Indigenous cohort. And we've looked at a range of goodness of fit estimates and entropy to determine what is the best model, running from between 2 to 5 class solutions. We found that the optimum model for both the Indigenous and non-Indigenous cohort had 3 groups. So this is the Indigenous cohort. As you can see, we've got a quite high offending group here that we've called the early onset chronic group. They start, as the name suggests, offending at quite an early age. They peak in their offending in the early 20s and then drop in the mid to late 20s. We then have a second class which we've referred to as the adolescent onset moderate offending group. They start offending slightly later, but they have a fairly moderate and consistent rate of offending over the life course through to the late 20s, where they start to reduce their offending. And then we've got the final class here, which we've referred to as low rate and non-offenders. They comprise about 50% of the cohort. And in that class, we have some people who've offended sporadically over that time period, but not at a consistent enough volume to be included in either of the other 2 classes. So I should just note for that early onset chronic group, they comprise 13% of the cohort, and the adolescent onset moderate offending group comprise 37% of the cohort. So approximately half of the Indigenous cohort is in one of the offending groups. Moving now to the non-Indigenous cohort. So we have, again, what we've termed an early onset chronic offending group. They start fairly young and they peak in the late teens, early 20s, and then start to drop off in the mid-20s. We have another group that, in this group, we've called the adolescent onset low offending group. So they have a similar shape to the Indigenous group, but they're offending at a lower rate over that period. And they start at a slightly later point in their adolescence. And then finally, we have the low rate and non-offenders group, which again can include some people who've offended on some occasions over that time period, but not at a consistent enough or high enough volume to be included in either of the other classes. And that class comprises 84% of the cohort. So just putting these side by side really reveals some of the more obvious differences in the offending cohorts between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous cohorts. So if we look firstly at the class 3, what we've referred to as the early onset chronic group, in both classes it seems to have a fairly similar shape, but in the Indigenous cohort they begin at a slightly younger age than in the non-Indigenous cohort. They are also offending at a much higher volume, so they've got mean offences that are about twice the volume of the non-Indigenous cohort. And in addition, they comprise a much larger proportion of the overall birth cohort. So in the Indigenous group, this early onset chronic group is almost 6 times as much as in the non-Indigenous cohort. Looking at the next group, the adolescent onset, what we've called moderate in the Indigenous and low in the non-Indigenous. Again, similar shape in the trajectory, but these young people in the Indigenous group started offending slightly earlier and at a higher volume, again, almost twice as much as in the non-Indigenous group. And again, what's really notable is the differences in size of these, what we've called adolescent onset offending cohorts. So it's almost more than twice the size in the Indigenous cohort as it is in the non-Indigenous cohort. And then unsurprisingly, in this low rate and non-offenders group, it's a much smaller proportion of the Indigenous cohort than it is of the non-Indigenous cohort. So taken collectively, it suggests that at this period in time, the service responses that were available for Indigenous young people, beyond just criminal justice service responses, given the early age at which they're beginning offending, weren't as effective in dealing with the underlying drivers of that offending behaviour for Indigenous young people compared with non-Indigenous young people. I'll hand back over to Troy now.
So moving on to our second research question, which was, can we develop better estimates about the direct criminal justice system costs of offending? So the costing approach that we used assessed the direct criminal justice system costs, so the cost of police, courts, youth justice and corrections. We considered a number of key cost drivers in developing our unit cost estimates, so whether a young person was diverted by police, offence type, whether or not there was a trial and location. In this project, we are producing both upper bound and our best estimate based on top-down and bottom-up costing approaches, but today's presentation we're going to be focusing on the upper bound estimate. So that reflects the long-run impacts on demand. So it's essentially disaggregating budgets based on factors that we know. In terms of our costing methodology, so with the top-down methodology, we gathered a whole heap of information from each of the agencies, so finance and HR data, aggregate cost data from public sources, and administrative or agency data from the agencies. We also undertook a number of interviews with youth justice and corrections staff to work out how long they spent on various orders and different types of activities, which helped us disaggregate budgets. So the unit cost estimated, so for police it was cost per offending incident, so this is most serious offence. For courts it was cost per most serious charge finalised, and for youth justice and corrections it was cost per custody day and cost per community-based orders based on the main types of orders that we found to differ in terms of the length of time that officers spent on them. So I'll hand over to Molly now, who will go through the detailed costing approaches for each of the agencies.
Thanks, Troy. I hope not to bore you with this section, but we'll try and describe as well as we can what we've done to get what Troy described as our upper bound estimates. So we're using a top-down methodology, and as he noted, our next step is to go to the bottom-up best estimate process. So as Troy mentioned, what we're costing in the police area is the offending event. That's all the offences linked to an individual in a particular occurrence or an incident. And we've excluded traffic offences in our analysis. So one of the key data sources we've used is cross-sectional recorded crime data from police. And through that, we've estimated the number of offending events with different types of outcomes. And we've classified those outcomes into caution, conference, court, and other. And other represents things like diversion into programs, or infringements or fines. Those are the kinds of outcomes that people might receive. So we've considered the relative time and focus of police operational activity and used that to apportion the budget for regional operations, which includes general duties activities and also investigation activities. So the Child Protection Investigation Unit and the Criminal Investigation Branch are included in that budget. And then the Special Operations budget, which covers specialist services. So for both of those budgets, we've excluded out relative resources that are allocated to community engagement and road policing expenditure. So we estimated general duties, police general duties time across different offending events using ITAS data from the Queensland Police Service. So this is data that general duties police use to record their activities. And we linked that with recorded crime data to understand what is the kind of mean length of time that general duties officers spend on different types of offending events according to the type of the most serious offence. We've then inflated that amount by the relative ratio of the investigation resources, because we don't have a better measure to know how much time is spent in terms of investigation on those different types of offences. And then for offending events that lead to court, we've done an additional calculation. We've also added on the relative EFT of the specialist services that are relevant to particular offences from the specialist operation budget. So for example, there's a specialist homicide group. We've allocated that additional funding onto homicide offences. There's a child safety and sex crimes group. We've allocated that additional funding onto sexual assault offences. And there's a fraud and cybercrime group. We've allocated that onto fraud offences and so on. So that expenditure that we've allocated to the specific offences is then obviously divided by the volume of those offending events within an annual period. And we've estimated a cost for police activity resulting in caution and conference, and a cost per offence leading to court. And you can see them here. So for offending events that end in a caution or a conference, we've costed those at $1,751 and $1,600 respectively. And then you can see for the events leading to court that we've got much more detailed costing estimates based on the most serious offence of those offences. So unsurprisingly, homicide is quite high, and in fact a lot of the crimes against the person offences are relatively high, and that makes sense when you consider the additional resources that specialist detection, investigation, etc. resources that police have to deal with those types of offences. So now I'll move on to the court costing approach. So we have looked at the number of court matters that were finalised by offence type, and we've excluded those that have moved into other courts so that we avoid double counting them. We've looked at the time devoted to trials across particular offence types, taking into account both the proportion of offences that go to trial and then the length of those trials, taken from a recent study by Wan and Weatherburn, and also looked at the time devoted to court attendances outside of trial time. And so we've estimated a total court time by most serious charge, and then we've used the overall expenditure for courts, and we've disaggregated by that relative proportion of time across the offences, and then divided obviously by the volume of matters finalised per most serious offence. So these are our upper bound cost estimates for matters finalised in courts according to the most serious charge. Again, unsurprising to see homicide as one of the higher ones, and also sexual assault and related offences, given that Those trials can be quite long, and that many of them do in fact go to trial. Moving now to the youth justice order costing approach. So what we've done with youth justice orders, firstly, is to group them according to their relative resource intensiveness. And we've done that both through examination of policy documents and through interviews with 5 youth justice service area managers and supervisors around Queensland. So that we've developed a relative time weighting for those orders. And I should just say that the orders here are listed from least to most resource intensive. So community service orders obviously are quite low in resource intensiveness, and then conditional release and conditional bail programs tend to be very high in terms of the level of contact required with services, with probation and supervised release being in the middle of those two. So that relative time weighting was applied to the estimated annual number of young people in each of the order types and the average length of those orders, so a total order days estimate. And then we've allocated the total expenditure on youth justice orders across the order types with this weighting in mind. And further, we've then, with that allocated expenditure, we've divided by the estimated annual days across order types to get a cost per day. For detention, the cost of detention we've estimated by disaggregating a detention centre budget by the total number of days of detention that centre delivered. And then for conferences, we've disaggregated the total funding for youth justice conferences in Queensland by the total number of conferences held in that same year. So this is the estimates of orders we've got, and those costs obviously reflect the relative resource intensiveness of those orders for workers. We've got a cost here of $11,340 for a youth justice conference. And I should just note that while that might look relatively higher to the other costs, that is a total cost of the sanction, whereas the others are a cost per day, and so that will obviously vary according to the total order length that the young person is on. And then we've got a total cost of detention at $1,497. Moving now on to the adult corrective services activities. So we've taken the overall expenditure for community corrections and correctional centres and divided this into whether they operate in a major city or a regional and remote area. This was an area where we're interested to look at whether location makes a difference to cost. In terms of custodial cost, we've looked at correctional centre expenditure and divided by the annual number of custodial days across the locations to get an estimated cost per day. For community-based orders, we did something similar to what we did in the youth justice sector. We arranged or grouped the orders according to their relative resource intensiveness, so community service orders obviously being relatively low, and then intensive correction orders being the highest, and probation and parole being somewhere in between those two. And that weighting of resource intensiveness was based on interviews we conducted with 5 caseworkers from different locations around Queensland. So then we've allocated the community corrections expenditure across orders by applying this time weighting to the total order days across each of the order types, and then dividing the resulting expenditure by the total days within each order type. So these are our estimates for the upper bound estimates for our corrections outputs. So again, you can see that the relative resource intensiveness is reflected there in terms of cost per day. And then we've got the incarceration cost that actually looks quite different according to major city and regional remote, and that's something we need to delve into a bit further to understand why that might be the case. It doesn't appear to make a really material difference in terms of the cost of orders, although we understand that there's a lot more cost allocated to travel and staff time spent on travel in these regional and remote areas. I'll hand back over to Troy now.
Okay, so while we're yet to apply the costs to the different offending trajectories, what we have done to give it some kind of indication of how much the different trajectories may cost is we've looked at the distribution of mean criminal justice systems across the life course. So if we look at the left-hand graph, we've got mean number of cautions and mean number of finalisations, both youth and adult, for the Indigenous and non-Indigenous cohorts, and for the 3 trajectory groups within each. And on the right-hand side, we've got mean probation and parole days and mean custodial days for the Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups, and for the 3 trajectories. So if we look at the adolescent onset moderate group, you can see that the Indigenous group has 4 times as many court finalisations and 5 times as many probation and parole days and 10 times as many custodial days as the non-Indigenous group on average. And if we look at the early onset chronic group, we can see that the Indigenous group have on average 3 times as many court finalisations, 2 times as many probation and parole days, and 4 times as many mean custodial days. So based on the context that they have, it's likely that there will be significant cost differences between the groups. So our next steps are to finalise the top-down estimates and calculate bottom-up estimates, to validate these costs with agencies, and to apply the costs to patterns of contacts from the linked cohort data, and to project these as future costs. So we'll estimate for a cohort who were aged 10 in 2016 and 17 based on the 83-84 cohort data. And then we'll discount costs at 7% annually and estimate a net present value of future costs for each offending class. So in conclusion, Indigenous peoples have a much higher rate of contact with the criminal justice system. Offending groups for Indigenous peoples have a much higher relative volume of contacts with the justice system over their early life course. There's considerable variability in costs based on offence type, types of community-based orders and locations of criminal justice system contact, and the costs of the trajectory groups are likely to vary considerably given the large variation in mean volume of contacts with the justice system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Troy and Molly. Do we have any questions? Yep, up the front here. Sorry, can you just wait for the mic so we catch it?
Yeah, I'd like to ask, in relation to the costs for police that you've inferred to crime, my understanding is that most governments set police resourcing independent of crime levels, and over the last 10 years or so we've seen crime levels come down but police resourcing increase. And so in terms of actual costs avoided, is it really valid to include police?
I think you could argue that for many different areas of the criminal justice system. And in fact, it's very hard to do this work in the public sector because supply and demand don't operate in a predictable way. And in fact, supply often doesn't follow demand for many, many years. And in fact, like you're saying, can come when there is no change in demand. So there's not really an easy way around that. But offending does have an imputed cost attached to it. These organisations do respond to that. We've called this, in terms of the top-down estimates or the upper bound, these reflect long-run changes in demand. So presumably over a 10-year period, if demand was to change, some of those fixed costs may change. Policing budgets may change over a longer period. Our bottom-up estimates will reflect more of the short-run effects of demand, so they'll be much more granular. But it's an issue in general, I think, in costing in the public sector where supply and demand don't have a predictable relationship.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yep, one down here.
Oh, hi. I guess I'm just trying to reconcile the trajectory stuff with the costing stuff that you've done. They're both quite ambitious, and the costing is usually done at a point in time. So I wondered whether you expected not only to try to put costs to offending, but also to do that over the life course, because you're showing a trajectory that goes to age. So at different ages, of course, the costs will be different because they go back in time. So I wondered if you were going to try and attempt that or not.
Yeah, so we will. We'll be using what you could broadly call as an incidence costing approach, which is to take a cohort and project those activities, presume that those activities occurred at a future time point, and discount those costs accordingly. So we assume that the patterns of contact are similar into the future for a cohort that was aged 10 in 16, 17, and we'll have our base year of costs as 16, 17, and then those future costs are discounted to reflect the fact that they will have a different value into the future, and then we create a net present value. So it's an approach that's more often used in public health than in criminology, but it's a valuable one for giving an indication of what future costs may be avoided if you were to set your policy settings in a different way.
I think we have time for one more quick question. So Melinda, you've already got a microphone. So.
Using ANZOC division as your separation of crime, so some of those divisions like accident intended to cause injury have quite a wide variation of seriousness within it, has from common assault to GBH all the way up, and a disproportionate number of offences within that. If there's a difference in patterns between Indigenous and non-Indigenous population within those ANZOC divisions, could that sort of mess with your unit cost use of at that high level?
Well, the unit costs will, unfortunately, they have to be an average of whatever variability in seriousness and resourcing happens within that ASOC category. In terms of Indigenous and non-Indigenous, they will have the same unit costs applied, and the differences in the relative costs of those trajectories will fall out of the volume of contacts and the nature of the offences within the ASOC category, but not at a lower level. So we would have liked to have done more, but as someone mentioned, this is an ambitious project already, so we had to stick with that level. You know, things like drug trafficking, there's a lot of resources that go into that, and that inflates the cost of drug offences, whereas possession is, you know, obviously of a much lower magnitude. So unfortunately, we've had to ignore some of those differences. But yeah, the differences with Indigenous will fall out of patterns of volume of contacts and types of contacts and types of offences.
All right, and we're going to have to wrap that up there. Thank you very much, Troy and Molly.